So we're really incredibly fortunate here to have Margaret Levi with us today to talk about universities in an era of democratic backsliding. Margaret is Professor Emerita of Political Science at Stanford, as well as a Senior Fellow at the Center for Democracy Development and Rule of Law. She's written lots of books and many articles, numerous articles, but a number of them are really canonical pieces in political science. She's also a member of the National Academy of Sciences, the British Academy, the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. She's been a Guggenheim Fellow, and she has too many prizes to list, but just so you know, you can find all of that on her website. But she's also served in a couple of roles, which I think make her a really great person to be thinking about this question today. First, she served as president of the American Political Science Association, so has thought a lot about kind of what is the discipline of political science do collectively. She was, until just a few years ago, the director of Stanford sort of university within a university, so the Institute, the Center for the Advanced Study in the Behavioral Sciences. And she's also the author of a report that speculates on the kind of fictional future of higher education. And so she's been
I'm the author of a fictional report.
The author of a report that speculates on a fictional future of higher education. Sorry. So I thought what I would do is just spend the first kind of 20 minutes asking Margaret a few questions and then open it up to you. So please be thinking about the questions that you might have. But Margaret, you know, it will come as no surprise to anybody in the room that we're living in an era of democratic retreat. According to the VDEM Institute, the world has, since last year, for the first time, fewer democracies than it has autocracies. And that's happened for the first time in 2 decades. And the pathways of democratic decline today are rather different than they were several decades ago, right? We don't see sort of tanks rolling in the streets at least as frequently. We don't see militaries seizing power as such. Instead, democratic decline is really taking the shape of the repression of civil liberties. Again, VDEM said in its report last year that freedom of expression is actively in decline in 44 of 195 countries, right? So that's a quarter. That's really quite a dramatic change. And universities have in many ways been at the center of that. And so we've seen that not just in the United States, although that's probably the most prominent and salient for a number of reasons. We've seen it in countries like Hungary, like Turkey, like India. And so my first question to you is really to ask you, why is it that universities are so central to these nationalist, populist politicians who are elected? What about universities makes them a target for for attack by these kind of would-be autocratizers?
Well, I think there's more than one reason. There are a number of things that universities do that makes them, from the perspective of potential autocrats, the enemy. One is they provide a liberal arts education. They encourage people to think critically. I think that's not an insignificant part of it, because part of the autocratic handbook is to get people to stop thinking critically, to stop asking questions, to be fearful of raising concerns and complaints. And universities are about getting people to argue, to think outside the box, to do that. They're also, universities are also the base of at least two other important things that I think have become a source of enmity. Student protests and demonstrations. I mean, a lot of movement activity throughout the history of at least the 20th century in the US, or the late 20th century in the US, was, as well as the 21st, has really been about students mobilizing in a variety of ways that lead to fundamental changes in practices of government, whether it was the war in Vietnam or the civil rights movement or the women's movement, and now, you know, the issues around the war between Israel and Gaza. So that's a second reason. I think a third reason really has to do with scientific knowledge and innovation. So it's not just the free speech and the critical thinking, but there's also a real anti-science movement going on right now in the United States. It's part of the populist instinct here. And that's, so, shutting down the grants and doing all of that is not just because it's, the fourth reason has to do with the elite versus, they're perceived as elite institutions. But there's also, I think, a real systematic effort to dissemble science and to undermine the scientific enterprise. So I think those are 4 reasons that the universities are perceived as serious problems to the populist autocrats.
So I just want to ask you, though, next, if you think that there's any merit to some of the arguments that get made. The arguments have a slightly different flavor for why universities are a problem in this era. So, there's a kind of, I think, broad umbrella that in some ways universities, in some way, shape, or form, universities are not representative of the population at large. And there's an argument that that's a problem. And so, it takes the form of being foreign in Hungary. Universities are funded by foreign actors. In India, it takes the shape of universities are kind of anti-national supporters of Pakistan. And in the United States, it's taken the form of universities are houses of anti-Semitism. So I guess I just want to ask you, is there any merit to those arguments?
Well, I'm not going to speak to India at the moment or some of the other Hungary, for which I think there is, in Hungary's case, there was no merit for the argument. In India's case, you'd be a better judge of that. In the US, I think the argument about the elite role of the university and how it's perpetrating a certain elite is true of some of the elite universities. I mean, Raj Chetty's work and other people's work show that. So I think some of that criticism is fair, but to talk about the universities as if it's only elite universities is also a terrible mistake, but a mistake that's being perpetrated by, the universities that were being considered, that were subjected to congressional interrogation today were not necessarily elite universities, and they're going after, the Trump administration is going after some of the publics as well. The university system is a very complex system that provides different things for different groups of people, so it's not just the elite universities. So I think, and when you look at the Trump administration, an awful lot of them went to Harvard and Yale and Penn and all those places, including the president. Including his vice president. So, a lot of this, I think, is crap around those issues. In terms of the anti-Semitism, I find it alarming and actually quite threatening to myself as a Jew to claim that the universities are where anti-Semitism is being bred. I was telling Nairi earlier, I am now considered an anti-Semitic Jew because I'm critical of the Netanyahu government. I should be allowed as an American citizen and as a Jew to say that, I can be a proud Jew and not agree with this government. So I think they're weaponizing anti-Semitism. There's no question that there's anti-Semitism in the United States. I suspect, however, if they did the reports over time, they would find there's always been anti-Semitism at the universities. They didn't seem to care very much when there were restricted covenants of various kinds. Now they care a lot. And certainly the attack on some Jewish students has gone up. The intensity of the debate around has certainly led to lots of Jews being believe if you're Jewish, you must be anti-Palestinian. And there's no reason, even if you are pro-Israel, that you should be attacked. But if you look at the Harvard reports, again, we were talking about that earlier, there was also one about Islamophobia, which is much higher than anti-Semitism, and they're not worried, the administration doesn't seem to be worried about that, even though it talks about freedom. So I think this is a cover-up for, this is feeding into a group of people who are big sources of income to the Trump campaigns, people like Sheldon Adelman and his family, and Liam Acker, whatever his name is, and others who have been big contributors to the Trump campaign and are using this to attack the universities and want to support Israel no matter what.
So, but let me just ask you, sort of aside from the anti-Semitism angle, a kind of a slightly different critique that the Trump administration has made, but also that other Democratic backsliding governments have made of universities, is that they're not politically representative of the broader population, right? And that's important because, as you yourself just said, many of the key leaders of courts, of parliaments come from these elite institutions. So I'm curious what you make of that argument. And
well, I think there's several problems with that argument. One
Yeah.
is, I don't know of any university, maybe one of you does and could inform me of it, who discriminates on the basis of political beliefs. I mean, people are accepted because of the quality of their work and mind, and something happens at the university that tends to make people more liberal rather than less liberal. So I don't think if you looked at the students who come in that they're necessarily all, I mean, I have both at the University of Washington where I taught before Stanford, and at Stanford I had lots of students whose backgrounds and earlier beliefs had been on the right rather than on the left. And there's a diversity there. Now, is it an adequate diversity? That's a question, and I think that's worth exploring. I think the other issue, which is one that I know at least Stanford and several other universities are addressing, is how do you create tolerance for alternative positions, whether they be right versus left, but whether they be Gaza versus Israel. And so things like, I know you're a graduate of Stanford, so you've been reading about college and the civic education. I taught in that course, which was really a way to introduce students into debate, to really, they can disagree strongly, but they have to learn to have civil debate about it and to figure out what their positions are. So I think there are real issues about how we've been teaching. I mean, here's my bigger problem with all of this, is that, and I've talked to a couple of you about it, which is that I think some of the criticisms that are coming from the right-wing populists have some basis. I mean, there are problems with the ways in which government have been delivering services to people, and their over-bureaucratization and over-regulation. There are problems with universities which have not always served well all of the population, even if we're talking about the complex of universities. And there are real criticisms to be made and real changes that have to occur, but this is not the way to do it. You don't take a chainsaw to institutions. You have to be nuanced about it, but committed to real fundamental change. So that report, that fictional report I wrote with two co-authors, is really about what the university should be like in 2100. And I see it as radically different than what it's like now. Radically different. I mean, technology will have changed that, the population demography will have changed that, the nature of work will have changed that, the nature of research and collaboration will have changed it. And where the university has not been responding adequately to that. But that's not an effect of anti-Semitism of the university or lack of acceptance of diversity. That's an effect of us who are academics or potential academics being very immersed in a way of doing things that may no longer be the way they should be done.
So one more question, and then I'll come to you for your questions. And this is a formulation of a question that I heard actually Jane asking already. So some university presidents have caved very quickly, Columbia in particular, of course. But again, not just in the United States. That's happened in Ashoka University, for example, in India. And others, I'm thinking here of Chris Eisgruber at Princeton, Michael Roth at Wesleyan, and Alan Garber at Harvard, have come out not just very vocally and signing petitions and collectively, But they've all said, or those three university presidents have talked about the need to act collectively.
Yep.
Right, to kind of come together. And notably, Stanford's president did not sign that letter with that 150 plus university presidents.
600.
Is it now 600? Okay, right. So as an institution that has kind of not collectively acted with other universities, how do you think about that, and how do you think about the role of universities acting collectively to carve out space for dissent?
Well, I don't want to defend the decision not to sign the letter. I wrote to John Levin and to Jenny Martinez, the provost, and said, why aren't you signing this letter? As lots of us did. At this point, I do hear an argument that the letter isn't what's really important. What is important is, collective organization. And I don't know what Stanford is doing about that, but I do know what some other universities are doing. And there is a lot of discussion now. There are at least two that I know of, which means there are probably others because I'm not that tied in. There's a discussion going on among some of the private universities, the elite private universities, about how to act collectively and not be picked off one by one, but to pool resources to fight. And I don't know how far along that discussion has gotten, but it's certainly something that's on the agenda of many presidents. And for all I know, it's on the agenda of presidents who did not sign. I mean, they may be part of that movement even if they didn't actually sign the letter. And I wouldn't be surprised if Stanford is part of those discussions. The other movement like that I know of is among the Big Ten plus. So some of the major public universities, better known for their football teams often than for other things, but are very first-rate public universities, have begun to organize collectively, somewhat stimulated by demands from their faculty, which is an important part of this story, and sometimes stimulated by also supported by their boards, which has to be brought to bear in the US system as well. So I can't answer exactly why Stanford hasn't done it, but I do think it's important to stand up collectively, to stand up and then to stand up collectively. I don't know how much difference it will make in the short run, but what it does do is signal that there are people who are willing to take the heat and will not, be complicit. And that gives other people backbone. So, initially 100 universities signed that and some academies. And now it's over 600. So, these things have a cascading effect. That's why they're important to do. But this one's now at the performative level. And we need the next step. We need the actual organization.
Great. Let me turn to your questions. Ben.
Hi, Margaret.
Hi, Ben.
Oh, sorry. Sorry. For our online audience.
Oh, yes.
You know about online audiences, Ben.
Yes.
Thank you. So I'm Ben Ansell from the politics department. You mentioned, Margaret, the important role of a liberal arts education. Obviously, I agree with that as somebody who teaches politics. With that said, a number of the people who are most aggressively attacking higher education now are products of America's fine liberal education systems. J.D. Vance studied politics and philosophy. Peter Thiel studied philosophy. Alex Karp, head of Palantir, also studied philosophy. So I'm just interested in your views about whether liberal arts education really creates an open mind or attracts people to Straussian philosophy or things that might be
It's going to do everything. I mean, and that's, I think we're democracies in principle, or we're trying to survive as democracies, and that means we have to tolerate a lot of different kinds of perspectives. You're citing those, but there are also people who have intense views about their identity, which create conflicts and which I may have problems with or not have problems with, depending on it. And that's part of what we need to be as a society, as a really seriously plural society, which allows that debate to go on, but doesn't, I mean, the difference of the people you named is they have an incredible amount of money and power. And what we need to, that's solved a different way. That's not, the university's not going to solve that. That has to be solved by other kinds of government actions and regulations that limit that power and limit the influence of that kind of money in politics.
Eric next, and then we have an online one.
Great, thanks. This can also be seen as a battle over power, and universities have a certain kind of elite power. You know, Harvard was able to get a who's who of top conservative lawyers to sign on to its lawsuit. So in those kind of elite spheres, universities can step in the ring and play. But what they seem to be lacking is popular power. The polling I've seen says the attack on universities is very popular among Trump's base, and most of the rest of the voters just kind of don't care.
Right.
And so, if you're and a majority of Trump's voters didn't go to college. So if you're a working class person in Ohio, why should these rich universities getting all these tax dollars, why should I support that? Now, there's the obvious argument, okay, the medicines you're taking, the technology in your iPhone, whatever, the sort of scientific stuff, defense, but that's a fairly, narrow argument. How do we more broadly make universities popular?
Well, I think there are a couple things that once again, let me reemphasize that the universities are not just the elite universities. And an awful lot of people who don't get 4-year degrees do get 2-year degrees. And those institutions are also basically under attack right now as well, even if the domino effect hasn't gotten all the way down there yet. So I think what these universities are doing, they don't necessarily, this case does not necessarily need popular support. It needs legal support. It needs to win in the courts. It needs to show that free expression is still there, that some of the things that the Trump government is doing are illegal. They're literally illegal. And that's got to be demonstrated. So I think that's part of the importance here. Whether it reaches the whole public or not, I mean, with the presidential election system, we're still 3 3/4 years away from another election. So I think there are other principles here than just mobilizing voters that are incredibly important. And the other thing about it is, even if the public doesn't understand this totally, if at all, is that the way in which scientific innovation is organized in the US, because of Vannevar Bush and a whole lot of other things that happened in the 1930s and subsequently, is it was established in a way that the university scientists play an incredible role. It's not done privately. That's where the federal money is going. And that's where a lot of the federal money is leaving. So it really does matter for not only the quality of health and medicine that we have, but it also matters for our international competitiveness and for our capacity to innovate as a country. Now, I think the scientific enterprise is going to be fine because they will migrate. I'm seeing Jews going back to Germany, because of the Max Planck Institutes, right? Larry Kramer, in whose building I'm staying right now, whose home I'm staying in right now, is, trying to recruit, I'm sure you are too, trying to recruit American scholars who want to run away from what's going on in the States. So the scientific community will survive, but it's going to be incredibly damaging to the United States' capacity to provide medical and scientific and all kinds of other innovations that have made us great.
So I'm just going to read a question online from one of our students, and then maybe we could give yes. So the question is, are universities teaching the right thing today? Many of today's political leaders demonstrate that they've learned strong hard and soft skills, but they lack a moral compass. Has moral education been wrongly relegated to the private sphere?
Well, that's a hard question to answer. I mean, that the responsibility of universities was once, when they were basically religious organizations, was obviously to provide a moral compass, but it was a particular moral compass and a very sectarian moral compass. So I'm not sure that it's the job of universities to inculcate a moral compass. It is the job of universities, and I think, again, what Deborah Satz and others have been doing at Stanford, and I just know that one because it's also happening at Chicago. I mean, it's happening at many institutions, which is rethinking what civic education means and the responsibility of universities to provide a kind of civic skills and civic education. And not, how does a vote become a law kind of civic education, but really the kinds of skills to engage in debate, to provide leadership, to think about what you all are doing here, to think about how to make policy, to have policy in the drawer when the moment comes to bring it out. So I think all of those things are incredibly important, and that's a little different than moral. I mean, people are going to have different values, but they should be able to discuss those values, and they should be able to understand that they have some kind of obligation to engage as a citizen in the polity in which they live.
We have one back there. Yeah. Yes?
Yeah, hi. I'm Margaret. This is Kamlesh. So I'm a Chris Fuller and attending a fellowship here at Oxford. So my question is more about, in the Asian context, where the governance of the universities are really, it's super controlled by the government.
I'm having trouble understanding you,
Yeah.
sorry.
So I'm saying I'm just, have a question more of the Asian context, where the universities, have a very, super controlled by the government and have no leeway. If I just come closer and speak, I think that will make sense for me. Yeah, I mean.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I'm just talking about more of the Asian context where the universities is super controlled by the government and have little less leeway, like more of the liberal arts. And there have been instances where universities, build the, the liberal education over decades, but now it's getting sliced down. There have been more of the shutting down the department, removing the professors, and where private sector investment to the university, to promote the liberal art is quite challenging and difficult, because again, it's controlled by the government. How do you see, especially in more of the Asian context, particularly the Indian context, like how the liberal arts will be promoted, or maybe find a way in the universities?
Well, in that case, it sounds like if the question is where top-down control is being exercised by government against liberal arts education, is that, how do you deal with that? Well, that sounds like a fight not from the inside the university, but a collective fight by the polity against the government. I mean, that's autocratic behavior that has to be stopped. And the only way to do that is to mobilize the public, and to the extent that the courts are functioning, to mobilize the courts. I don't see how the university can do that by itself.
Yeah. Jane.
Thank you. This has been fantastic. So I wanted to kind of pick up on a point you made earlier about the kind of the university sector being very broad. And certainly, as you know, in the UK, many universities are facing serious financial difficulty, and many in the US are as well.
Right.
And I think, thinking of this fictional report, which I haven't read.
I'll send it to you.
Yeah, no. But if we're thinking about, changes in cohort sizes, new technology, and so on, the university of the future almost certainly will look different and will serve different people. And I'm wondering how you think, assuming we have kind of a post-Trump moment of rebuilding, are there ways to think about rebuilding the system better, or in a context like the UK, where we're not seeing the same kind of attack, but we are seeing kind of underfunding and prolonged kind of starving of parts of the sector. If there is a sort of revitalization of it, sort of what would be ways to make it work better?
So this fictional report that I and two others wrote is for a volume that some of the people at Arizona State are putting out on the future of the university, and we actually all finished our articles before Trump was inaugurated. So there is a question, independently of the Trump administration, or independently of some of the politics of what's going on in various countries, of what the university should be like, how it has to change. And some of us feel, I among them, feel that it needs some radical overhaul. So just to lay out some of the issues that we raise in there, one of the things is universities have to be, or the higher education system, has to be a place for lifelong learning. It can't just be about a set of people who are between the ages of 17 and 22. They may not, we start off saying that some of the campuses have now become like places where tourists go and visit, like the old castles, because a lot of education will be remote or through AI in various ways. All kinds of things can be done by that. But there still needs to be in-person interactions. So finding new architectures, finding new ways to make that happen. There has to be internationalization. It can't just be one country. The professoriate is going to have to change in a variety of ways. Tenure may go. Other forms of if we have a social structure that actually supports people, it means all kinds of work is possible, not just industrial jobs or whatever in principle is supposed to be the jobs. It means that you can have a professoriate that feels secure, but doesn't keep teaching when it's not interested or when it's not doing a good job of teaching. Research has to be collaborative. We already have that model in hard science, but not necessarily in the social sciences or in the humanities. Cross-disciplinary. I can go through a whole list of things that are really different. But I think the crucial thing is taking advantage of the new technologies and recognizing that AI is going to be a provider of information in a very different way than we're used to having it, and then making it work with us and for us rather than against us. And recognizing that universities or higher education systems have to be sources of lifelong learning and retraining and stimulation and civic education.
Valerie.
Hi, my name's Valerie, and I'm a MPP student here, but went to Stanford for business school. So I wanted to go back to one of your comments earlier about how universities aren't necessarily like filtering away conservatives. I guess I'm not sure I agree with that, but let's say that we were universities are just allowing for conservative students and professors, but sort of the outcome right now is a very small percentage of professors and students that we end up attracting are conservative. And there's so many efforts around affirmative action for, like gender or for race.
Not anymore.
Well, yeah, but I think that fundamentally universities believe that ought to exist, or considering getting people from different parts of the country. So shouldn't we be proactively trying to get different viewpoints in terms of political opinion?
It's an interesting question, and I don't really have an answer to that question. I do think that conservatives are not in the same category as people who have been seriously discriminated against. They haven't been financially discriminated against. They haven't been told they have to live in certain places. They haven't been repressed. I'm sorry, it's a different category for me than people of color, people who are very poor, women for a long time, maybe still. But it is an interesting question. How do you ensure, I think the question is, how do you ensure that there is a diversity of views and opinions at the university and at the higher education system? And again, I think in thinking about the future of the university, it's possible to do that. You can ensure that there are lectures from all kinds of points of view. And it's not just the set of faculty who were selected by whatever particular university. So you can introduce those things, and you can make it. You can get feedback from students to see when they're feeling like their opinions are not being valued, and try to do something about that. So I think there are things we need to do. I'm not sure affirmative action for conservatives is the way to go.
Pascal.
Hi, my name's my name is Pascal. I went to Harvard, also sit on a board at the university, but have been here for a while. And my question, I guess, is you answer the question of what's the purpose of sort of university in relation to sort of autocracies. And I wonder if your answer would change if I were to sort of ask you the question directly of what do you think the purpose of the university is. And I say that because I think in recent and high-profile cases, as in when Congress was interrogating the Ivy League schools and whatnot, I thought there was really a lack of an ability to communicate the work that is being done
I agree.
in that university and in the
Yeah.
context of which certain decisions were being made. And I think as a student, I also found it wasn't particularly clear. I think we all thought we were there because we'd get a good degree and then get a good job. And I really feel like I sort of learned over time that what you're doing there is really a lot more than that. And this is where I have felt like we've gone from. I don't know actually if I think there's a lack of conservative views. I actually felt while I was at Harvard there was quite a lot, but there was fear in particular classes, in particular courses
Yeah.
and I'm now hearing that safe spaces means you don't say anything offensive in section or in class, which I thought that used to meant you can say anything you want and you were supposed to defend your views and whatnot. There are trigger warnings on syllabi and so I'm just trying to understand, I think from a leadership perspective, and you've sort of been in the sector for a while, where is the leadership in terms at the university level in terms of, I think, inculcating and telling the students, what are we here to do, beyond just get really good degrees and potentially get good jobs. And I think while here at Oxford, I've also heard, education's going towards a service industry, and so there's a lot, when, or the presidents of certain colleges sort of cave to student pressures. And I guess I'm just trying to understand, I think from folks at the higher echelon of the university leadership, is there a conversation about what it is that you guys think you are doing at the university? Does that get down to the students in terms of what they think they're doing there? Or are we all just, getting degrees and hoping to get jobs? Because I think I've come to understand that there's a lot more to going to university than just getting a nice degree and getting a job. But I kind of feel like in the communications with the leadership, I'm not hearing any of it at all.
Well, I'm not a leader of a university, and I've never been a leader of a university, so I don't want that job. And right now, I definitely wouldn't want that job. I mean, I think it's a very tough job I'm of the view that the universities have. I agree with you about those congressional hearings. So that was pathetic, and I knew 3 of them. I knew 2 of them, of those women, pretty well, and one very well, and I was really surprised at how poorly they did. They really have better answers than that. But it was a terrible context, and we were seeing, basically that thing that was so embarrassing was like 5 minutes out of 7 hours of grilling. Yeah. So, I don't want to totally fault them for it, and they shouldn't have lost their jobs as a result. But that being said, I do think that there has been a problem. The universities have lost their way, I think, in part because there have been huge demographic changes, huge technological changes, all the reasons I was giving before for why the future of the university is going to look different than the present. Huge international changes, lots of things have gone on that are really different. And the universities, some of the leadership is confronting that. This volume that I wrote this fictional report for was initiated by Michael Crow, who's the president of Arizona State University, who is someone among others who, whether you like all of his positions or not, he is seriously trying to think about what the university needs to do and how it needs to change and what it needs to look like. And there are lots of others out there at very high levels of the university who are thinking about these questions. There are others who are not. So part of the process here is, I do not like what the Trump administration is doing, but, to look at the one potential bright side of it is it may help the universities to rethink and to begin to organize. In our little fictional report piece, we talk about the period between 2025 and 2050 as a period of remarkable change, that there was this attack on the universities, which was predictable, I mean, as I said, we wrote it before Trump was inaugurated. There was lots of disarray. There were lots of interesting experiments going on to think about different ways to provide education. And by 2050, a consortium, in our speculative fiction version, a consortium of leadership had coalesced, some of them from the universities, some of them from other sectors, had coalesced to bring together a number of these experiments and to create a new kind of university system that wasn't just about jobs and good jobs linked to good universities, and wasn't just about education for the sake of education, learning for the sake of learning, but really was reflective of what people needed and demanded at different periods in their lives. And sometimes it was the skills to get a good job. And sometimes it was the capacity to be a good leader or a good citizen. And so you can have a university or a higher education system that can really be a variety of things and engage the students themselves as part of the process of building that and sustaining that. And that's what I'd like to see happen, but it's not happening now. And at this moment, the universities are in the US and in India and in Hungary and in many other places are in a very defensive posture for reasons that we can understand. But you do see people like Alan Garber saying, look, some of the criticisms are right. We've got to do both things. We've got to resist and we've got to change.
Nairi.
Yeah, this is terrific. Thank you so much, Margaret. And I think we're often asked as academics in universities, or I am at least, what's the difference between what we do and what think tanks do, what consultancies do, what other parts? And most universities, most academics have two replies to that. And one is that the research that's done in universities is peer-reviewed. And the other is that we teach, right? And that teaching is an important part. I think we can probably all agree that the pedagogy of universities has long been ripe for a total revamp.
Right.
Most kindergarten teachers have spent a lot more time thinking about how human beings learn than most academics.
That's absolutely true. Yeah.
So, but I'd like to pick up a conversation you and I began earlier today about the special claim that academics make that university research is peer-reviewed, right? That it has a validity that your management consultants or your think tanks don't have, because it's quite an important concept. And yet, the peer review system upon which it rests is pretty rotten.
I agree.
We just finished the Kyoto Prize laureates lectures in the school, which we host each year. And every year, these titans of their disciplines explain that their path-breaking article was rejected in the peer review process. And it just highlights to me that there's something rotten in our peer review system. So I'd love to hear from you. What would you replace it with? Would you replace it? What would you do to it?
Yeah, it's already beginning to change, actually. I've been thinking more about our conversation, and we've jumped all over the place a bit. With open access journals becoming much more important and people putting things up before they've gone to a journal for peer review, is already beginning to change that whole process. And we run a journal together. We're part of a board I was telling you about that does a very different system than peer review. Now, these aren't the scientific articles that are making the advances, but the processes are beginning to change, and I think that's healthy. And the production of science is beginning to change. So what does peer review mean now, or at least the blind peer review, which is what you're really criticizing? There is peer review. I mean, you put something out there, you're a collaborative group, you have to get it checked. There's replication. There are all kinds of other things that are going on. I think the system has been slow to catch up, again, to some things that are already beginning to change. So I think the scientific part and the research part of universities is a critical function. The preservation and the creation of knowledge is one of the most important things that universities can do. But they have to rethink how that's done and how it's evaluated, and they have to think about that it's not just people at universities who are doing that. It's people who've worked in the development agencies. It's people who work in private sector, not just the Bell Labs, but who are working for, I don't know, Meta or whatever. I mean, there are people out there who are doing really interesting work. And there are experiments in how to produce that work, and I think that needs to be thought about. And that then gets back to the peer review process, which is, yes, work has to meet certain standards. It has to be shown that it really does make these advances, that its evidence is good. All of those things are fine, but that doesn't have to be done by a blind peer review process. There are alternatives out there that are already developing, and we should just encourage them.
Yes.
Thank you. This has been very thought-provoking. I'm curious your thoughts on the future of the Department of Education in the U.S. Obviously, the Trump administration has made it very clear.
I think it's dead.
And how that's going to impact the future of higher education. Also, you talked about the Supreme Court and courts being kind of a barrier. The Supreme Court obviously having a conservative majority and been wishy-washy with some Trump policies, but largely just been willing to give them the green light. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, the Department of Education, as a department, I think is probably finished. I mean, that's the plan, and I have no reason to not believe that. Its role in terms of education has really been to funnel certain kinds of money that is still funneling. It's just we're going to find out how chaotic that's going to become, given that there's been, I mean, it's not just education, it's every government agency has been disabled. So I think the public is soon going to learn that they need more government than they thought they did, or that Trump thinks they do. In terms of higher education, the issue really has to do with something that is being debated about, how we provide loans, student loans, and how those are secured. And here we have a case of direct corruption, since Trump runs private universities, or has done, that exploit people and don't allow them to pay back the loans that they give. I mean, force them into very bad loan situations. So that's the Department of Education problem. Some of this is going to have to be rebuilt at some point. Your other question was about the Supreme Court and the courts. I keep saying that even though it feels like it's been 200 years since Trump was inaugurated, it's actually been only about 100 days, a little more than 100 days. And courts operate very slowly, and we've seen a lot of judges standing up, and many of them are conservative judges. They're not Obama appointees or Biden appointees. They're Bush and Trump appointees who've been standing up. The issue is really not so much about policy in many cases, but due process and rule of law. And I don't know what the Supreme Court is going to do. It's considering some really critical cases. I think there's a very good chance that it will stand up on the birthright citizenship, and that it will stand up on some other things that are violating the rule of law. I think that's something, I don't think we can expect Alito and Clarence Thomas to go along with that. I don't know about Gorsuch. But I think Brett Kavanaugh and Roberts and Amy Barrett are thinking hard, from what I can tell, about some of these issues. They aren't policy issues. These are issues about respecting the law and upholding the law as it's written in the Constitution and by congressional legislation.
We have a question here. Yeah, just wait for it.
Thank you, Professor. Earlier today, we were talking about moral political economy. And I want to get back in a point you raised about the morals of a university.
Right.
What is this backbone of values that these institutions should have? I think we agree on the point that universities shouldn't be inculcating or doing too much proselytism around values. But at the same time, I find it very unsatisfying when universities only mobilize their values when they're being personally attacked, as is happening in the United States.
Well, I don't think that's fair. I mean, I went to universities and have taught in universities and have spoken at universities which have been upholding values for a very long time, and they're values of free speech, of free discourse, of scientific inquiry. So I think those are really important values that universities uphold, and that isn't about conservative versus liberal or conservative versus left wing. It's about, it's going back to the discussion about the Supreme Court. There's certain kinds of things that aren't about partisan politics, but are about what are crucial values for sustaining democratic polities and for sustaining universities that really can provide a decent education and a decent research capacity. And those are strong values. But that's different than saying you have to, you should do this policy as opposed to that policy. That childcare should look like this as opposed to that. Right? So it's different. That's where I don't want us to be imposing a morality.
Right here.
Building upon what you were speaking about earlier, the real need for genuine debate and differences of opinion in universities, what do you think are the necessary steps toward working toward that, especially when there seems to be a tendency to excoriate people who have differences of opinion, and at the same time there are populations that are greatly underrepresented in universities, maybe marginalized within them, how to balance the two?
Well, I think there are two answers. I mean, it's a really good question, and there are a couple of different possible answers to that question. One is, I've lived long enough to see multiple generations of students. They're not all like that. And so it could turn around again where there's more tolerance among students and less, canceling and other variants of ways in which, and you were talking about silencing certain voices. And I mean, this is a certain period in which that's been very strong among students. But I've lived through, some of the others in this room are not as old as I am, but have also lived through other periods where there's been more tolerance of diversity of opinion, right? So we could just be going through a demographic bump or a particular political period about that. But that being said, I also think that universities have responsibilities to find, I mean, it used to be assumed that that was going to be part of the university, and then the universities became much more demographically diverse, and suddenly that tolerance began to be more problematic. So, and I don't think universities, as we've said about a number of other things, have adequately adapted to the transformations of the student population in all kinds of systems, parts of the higher education system. And so they have to find new mechanisms for both teaching and for encouraging the capacity to be tolerant. And I think that's an ongoing project that doesn't have we have to all be committed to doing that. So I'm looking at you as the next generation, to be in universities and in public life, because you're at a public policy school, I presume. That's part of your responsibility. I'll help, but I've been doing that fight for a long time. We need the next generation to really step up to the plate here and to not allow those voices to be silenced, to speak up when voices are being silenced, even when you disagree with them, right? We have to do that collectively. That's got to be a collective value responsibility.
So I'm going to just take the last question, Margaret, if I may. You've you've given us a kind of a list of things that you think universities ought to be thinking about to future-proof themselves. New architectures for lifelong learning, not just in this formative period, internationalization, reform of tenure, promoting collaborative research and an effective use of technology. That's a lot of things, right? So if you could only choose kind of one thing that you think universities really need to focus on from that list, to start with at least.
Well, I don't do it that way. So I don't have single answers ever. But I do think what we were just talking about is a crucial thing that universities have to do is finding new ways to allow for diversity and tolerance of opinions. I mean, that's been a leitmotif throughout this discussion. And I do think the absorption of technology and the lifelong learning. I mean, I actually believe all those things have to be done together, or else it's not going to really work. So this is much more about complexity theory than it is about, you know, let's start on one and go down. I think we have to do several things at once. Whether I have the right order, I don't know. You know, that's also a subject of debate.
Well, listen, we've been really delighted and honored to have you here to at least have a conversation where I think some really important questions were asked, and I hope that you're all a part of continuing to have these conversations in all of our classrooms.
And we're counting on you.
Yes. Thank you very much to Margaret Levi for joining us.
Thank you all. Okay. So I took the microphone with me the last time.